population, not just in Europe, but this is a worldwide problem or opportunity as you look at it. Healthcare expenditure in the OECD countries with a particular focus on Europe. The crisis and the problem. The reason why we're having these sort of discussions, the reason why we're here today is because of the problem that presents itself with regards to disability, chronic disease, and patient care. Within the European healthcare market, we're going to take a look at what the market dynamics are, the opportunity, particularly in terms of IoT in the healthcare space, and a new option that's not being discussed, that's not really a part of the agenda, but I want to bring up, is about preventive healthcare, because a lot of focus is going into this for the future. And we get to the conclusions. So let's get started. The OECD tells us that the world is getting old, and not just, it was 1 billion years old already, and now it's 1 billion plus one. The population on the planet is steadily aging, and what you can see from this graph is basically that if you look at the total OECD countries, the average, the age range of the average population is going up. In Europe, the problem is even worse. So Europe is the red line, the world is the blue line. So Europe is older than the world. Now we come to an interesting part of that older population, the 65 plus. As people are getting older, thanks to modern science, thanks to modern medicine, thanks to better living conditions, we're also living longer. And as a result of that, the 65 plus population, Dong, you're not 65 yet, right?
No.
Good man. So he's not part of the problem. So the 65 plus part of the population is a significant area of focus, because as we will see later on, the cost of maintenance of healthcare for those above 65 actually goes exponentially higher as the population gets older. So these are things to think about. Now, with that in context, we're in Germany today. What does Germany look like? In the mid-1950s, about a decade after shit happened, that was what the population looked like. So you can see a significant cluster of a younger crowd, so in their 20s, 30s, and a subset that's in their 50s. But as we forecast populational metrics into 2050, what you can see is that the locus point shifts towards something that's very close to 80, because the life expectancy in Germany is already at 80 and going up. So by the time we get to 2050, the average person will be living to 80 years of age. So we already talked about 65 being the place where problems start. Imagine what happens at 80. And now we go into expenditure. In Europe, on average, 10% of gross domestic product is spent on healthcare. A significant part of that within the Euro area is government spending. So when it says public health, that is government health expenditure. So that's 8% with 2% added on through private spending. So private healthcare, private care in general. That is the opportunity. Now, with opportunity comes cost. What is the cost of maintaining this healthcare expenditure? So what you can see is in countries like the Netherlands, where I live, in Germany, on average per capita expenditure on health is over $4,000 per annum. And this is only going to go up. So we talked about 65 as the marker, 80 as a real problem. This is the statistics now. In the UK, on average, an 85-year-old man costs the National Health Services roughly 7 times more on average than a person in their 30s. 7 times. Not 7 more, not 70 more, not 700 more, 7 times. So if the average spending per capita on the general population is, let's say, 3,000, someone at the age of 85 is costing the healthcare system 21,000, 7 times. So the crisis. We have a population crisis. The population is getting older. Aging and illness. With the population getting older, with old age comes disability, comes the inability to take care of your basic bodily functions. Your organs start deteriorating, and as a result, you need more and more care. And that is called the healthcare burden. And this is for the governments to deal with. This is for the general population to deal with. This is for me to deal with when it comes to my parents. This is a personal problem, and there's no getting away from it. Now, thinking about my parents, both my parents are retired. They're both on pension. But does pension cover their healthcare needs? We will get into this in a little more detail a little bit later. But know this from the get-go, that the pension schemes today, other than for specific countries, cannot deal with the healthcare burden, especially as the average age of the population goes up, and especially as people start to live longer. If somebody retires, and in some countries the retirement age is 60, if they're living to 80 years old, then basically they started earning when they were, let's say, 25, they earned till they were 60. So they contributed for 35 years. And then for 20 years of their life beyond retirement, they have to be funded by the state or by pension schemes or out of their own pocket. No pension scheme is set up to deal with this kind of a macroeconomic problem. So the European Central Bank, for example, is evaluating new ways to look at how pension schemes should work. Is it defined contribution? Is it some alternate hybrid method where you put away as much as possible for your retirement? Because healthcare is a significant part of your retirement spending. And that's where technology comes in. So technology, be it in the world of finance, but here in this room, more directly towards healthcare. How can technology help reduce this burden? So let's look at the problem in a little more detail. The pressure on healthcare budgets is because of, we talked about the aging population, higher chronic disease incidence. Chronic disease is different from communicable diseases. So when you catch a cold, that's a communicable disease. A chronic illness is, for example, osteoarthritis, something that affects on average 40% of the population over 40 across the globe. Again, going back to my parents, my dad will probably need knee replacement surgery in 2 years. The implication, providers, particularly those in the public sector, are looking for ways to make budgets go further without compromising on the quality of care. What does that mean? That basically means, we talked about Europe where it's the 80-20 rule. 8% is government spending, 2% is private spending on healthcare. Given that, since it is the government that is doing most of the spending with regards to healthcare, they are trying to figure out ways in which they can take the allocated budget, because the budget isn't going up. The GDP on average, the world economy on average, is going up 2%. So even if they raise the amount budgeted for healthcare at that rate, it's not enough. It's really not enough. So they are trying to figure out how they can spend the same amount of money to get better results for the people that they are responsible for. The aging population in developed and developing countries puts additional stresses on the healthcare systems because people are living for longer. So before, you would retire at 60, and don't take this the wrong way, but you'd be dead by 70. Now, everybody's supposed to live till 80. I won't, I smoke too much, but that's my problem. Course won't either, he drinks too much. We'll be dead, don't worry, we won't be the burden on the system. But the trouble is, by 2060, 30% of the total population of Europe will be over 65. 30%, that's 1 out of 3 people. 1 out of 3 people will look gray, will have parts of their body that don't work, will need regular medical attention. How do we help those people? The pressure on the government expenditures is being felt in different parts of the world, but especially so in Europe because of that metric. But then, like I said, the overall economic growth is, give or take, on average 2.5% per year. That 2.5% extra is not enough. So as continuing advances in medical treatments are happening, what that also creates is additional drive for healthcare expense. Let's look at this, disability. Disability is an easy one to understand. You get older, you can't climb the stairs anymore. You get older, you need a lift. So before stairs were enough, now you need a lift. If there are stairs, you need a stand-a-stair chair. All of these things keep adding up. So there are different metrics that define it. So ADL, IADL, I'll talk about it later. But essentially what you can see is that, again, so when it comes to people aged 50 to 54 in 2014, the percentage of the population that is affected by functional disability. Functional disability means unable to do a normal task, like climbing the stairs. That's already 20-something% amongst women, about 15% among men. As we go to 65 plus, that functional disability goes up to almost 50% in women and 32% in men. You see the difference in the needs for men and women. The interesting part is this: when you look at the medical industry in general, other than women-focused studies on certain things, so one recent example is migraines. Women get migraines, my girlfriend gets migraines, there's not enough research on it because it's not well funded enough. However, if you look at these statistics, looking at things from a pure disability perspective, is there a need to create women-focused product? I think so. But what are they? Do we know? Maybe not. Let's go figure it out. So we talked about ADL and IADL. ADL is a severe disability, which basically means you can no longer function. You can no longer get out of bed. IADL is a less severe disability, which basically means things like climbing the stairs, picking up weights, doing the grocery every week. Functional limitation is, again, when you are unable to perform specific functions. So for example, if somebody asks you to work in an office, you can no longer sit for 8 hours because you need to lie down for 3. That's a functional limitation. And work limitation is sort of related to that. So this is Europe in general on the top, the UK in the middle, and the US at the bottom. The trends are the same. The numbers are a little bit different. In the US, people are fatter, so they screw up quicker. Even within the 65% range, you can see that the people affected by functional disability is almost 60% amongst women and the high 40s amongst men, whereas in Europe, it's about 40-something amongst women and 30-something amongst men. Women report higher rates of functional limitation. So there is every chart you look at, every graph you look at, whenever there is demographic study done separating men from women on the basis of disability over life, there's always a clear signal that women suffer more. However, there is not enough industrial research, academic research, medical research done to understand, 1, why, 2, how do we fix it, 3, most importantly, how do we help them? So that's a call to action. Chronic disease. Chronic disease, of the 56 million deaths globally in 2012, 38 million were due to non-communicable diseases. These are basically non-infectious or non-transmissible chronic illnesses which progress slowly. NCD deaths have gone up since 2000 and are expected to hit 52 million in 2030. Cardiovascular disease, so heart disease is always the big one. The second one is diabetes. That's why right now, all across the globe, food and beverage producers. So you're drinking, how many of you are drinking Fanta in the room? Hands up, please. Who's drinking the Fanta? Nobody. Brilliant. These are healthy people. Everybody's drinking the water. Good. Because if you're drinking Fanta, all you're doing is putting sugar into your system. And that's no good for you. So, reimbursement. We talked about public healthcare spending and private healthcare spending. A big part of the healthcare spending, the way it works, is reimbursement. You spend it first, then you go claim insurance. More and more, insurance is unwilling and unable to cover what you're expensing, because more and more it is seen as out of scope. Not out of scope because they want to put it out of scope. They're not mean bastards, they have families too. It is just they're unable to take on that burden. So the challenge for product creators, manufacturers, for people like you, is basically that you have to be able to generate clear evidence that the product you have created, the solution you have come up with, the service that you are aiming to provide creates a clear benefit which has preventive results. And we will get more into preventive medicine later. But if you can prevent, insurance wants to be part of your solution. Because by preventing, and this is why, so how many of you know that the Apple Watch, the data that the Apple Watch collects as of 2018 is FDA approved? You can take the data from your Apple Watch to a medical practitioner and say, here's my data. You can also use that data, because it is stored, to go to your insurance company soon, assuming that they catch up, and present your medical health status from that device as evidence to ask for a lower or higher premium. So I will get the higher premium, you will get the lower one. I drank the Fanta. But these kind of innovations, these are necessary. Because if you can prevent issues, everybody wants to participate. Everybody. Because this problem is not going anywhere. Now, cost and quality of care. So we talked about the 65 plus population. They are the most common recipients of care. Care meaning somebody to take care of them when they have an accident, etc. They get knee replacement surgery, they get hip replacement surgery, they live in a care home. Now, the cost of acute care, which is basically when you're in hospital. You have an operation, after the operation, you're stuck in hospital for a bit. That is the highest part of the cost spectrum. Then that is on average, so I think the official rate in the developed countries is around $400 per hour in cost. Not what you claim, not what you get paid back by insurance, but the average cost per institution, per patient. The cost of acute care is $400 an hour. So per day, you could be racking up, depending on the medication, the additional services, thousands per day. Home and institutional care costs less, definitely. And the fun part about home and institutional care is it is also better because it provides a better quality of life. Anybody would rather be at home with their family than lying in a hospital bed. It's as simple as that. When you feel better, your organism works better and heals better. So that's important to note as well. Assisted living, nursing homes, homes for the elderly, these are institutions that have seen a significant rise over the last decade and a half. And the reason for that is because the hospitals don't have enough beds. At home, there might not be enough people to take care of those that need it. So you have assisted living centers. So the implication is that care, the concept of care, is no longer you go to the doctor and you stay in hospital. The concept of care is coming to the house. It is personal. It is delivered at home. You can have food delivered at home. Why can't you have health care delivered at home? That's what we're talking about. So, home care costs. 65 plus on pension. Can you afford home care? The worry is this: if you have low needs, so you have low, moderate, high, or severe needs, and depending on the situation, the way they do the study is a moderate need is 40 hours a week. Low need is less than 22 hours, or 22 and a half hours a week. Severe needs is basically 60 hours and over per week of care. So from that perspective, that's the percentage of their income that it would cost for a person. So for a retired person earning a pension of 3,000 euros, let's say, in Germany, their cost of being cared for at home is, give or take, 15,000 per month. Where does that money come from? Open question, where does that money come from? Government. Because ultimately, that's why you vote, right? I want healthcare. I want healthcare, give me healthcare. And now if we go back to the beginning of the presentation and think about the fact that 1 out of 3 people will need this. How soon before the government says, I'm bankrupt? Sorry, no more money. Give up. And then we're all fucked. So, the home care cost for the elderly, the conclusion is this: only the richest can cover the high cost of moderate needs. So if you have a moderate need where basically you got knee replacement surgery or hip replacement surgery, and you are basically bedridden for more than half the week, and you therefore need care, only the richest can afford it, because 96% of their disposable. So here, the cost of home care, 22 and a half hours per week. This is the low one. 96% of the disposable income of someone in the 80th percentile. So the 20 richest percentage of the population, 100% of their disposable income would go on healthcare. And this is the 20 richest. The bottom half, forget about it. Here's a ticket. Check yourself out. So it's really not affordable. And this is why there's a need for preventive medicine. This is why there's a need for smart solutions. This is why there's a need to take the existing budget and make it go further, because there is no other choice. So let's talk about the market. The European healthcare market grew by about 3% in 2018 and has been growing at about an average 3%. So GDP has been going up at about 2.2 to 2.7%. Healthcare market going up higher than GDP. Why? Simple. People getting older, more people spending on healthcare. It's as simple as that. And that trend is not going to go anywhere. Because what you see is the forecast is that it's going to have a value of 2.4 billion from 2018 to 2023. That's 16.9% in the next 5 years. So if you do it compounded, it's at 3.5% per annum. Germany accounts for 22% of the European healthcare provider sector value, because all the good stuff comes from Germany. Siemens, German company. So Siemens is, I think, net the second largest aggregated healthcare solutions provider on the planet, after GE. So there's a huge demand for what is called augmented services. Augmented services is not about a company doing everything by itself. It is about building an ecosystem. You do one part, I do one part, somebody else does another part. Together we build an ecosystem where we're able to predict health and therefore make solutions happen for that. And by creating this sort of ecosystem, what you're trying to achieve is that by understanding what is coming, you can then pummel funds into research to deal with that problem before it becomes a catastrophe, before it becomes a crisis, before it becomes a disaster. The segmentation. So you have inpatient care. Inpatient care basically means in the hospital. When you go to the hospital, how much of it, more than a quarter is spent in the hospital. But that also means 3/4 is spent outside. So you have outpatient care, so by clinics, etc. You have medical goods over the counter, so you buy a blood pressure monitor to use at home. You buy a smart weighing machine to monitor your weight and check your BMI on a regular basis. All of those are medical goods. Long-term care. Long-term care is what we talked about. So the aging population, somebody needs to help them. That today is 16% of total healthcare expense. 16%. So 1 out of 6 dollars, euros spent on healthcare is spent taking care of people who are not in a hospital. They're at home. And that's the part that's going to go on. Because the other parts, the hospitals are full. In the Netherlands, very specific problem. Not enough nursing staff, not enough hospital beds, not enough doctors for specific fields. Oversupply of doctors in general practice, because a general practitioner can only deal with a very few problems. It's not enough to deal with the real issues that affect the population. So the GP is a band-aid, not a plaster. The other thing is in terms of market size, you have Germany, we talked about the biggest one, 22%. France, also a large population, and therefore 16%, followed by the UK, Italy, Spain, and the rest of Europe. The channels. We talked about the 80-20 rule. Here's the absolute proof. 77.6% is government spending. 22% is private. Now, let's look at the 5 forces. So, anybody here know about the 5 forces analysis? You're not allowed to raise your hand. Put your hand down. So, the 5 forces talk about the ability to understand the market from the perspective of the buyer, the supplier, degree of rivalry and competition, the threat of new entrants, so new solutions that the existing players haven't thought about, and substitutes. Here's the interesting part. In the healthcare space, substitute, nothing. Almost nothing. It would be 0, but they can't give it a 0, so they gave it a 1, 1.5. Degree of rivalry, there is intense competition. Buyer power, not much, because we all need the healthcare. Supplier power, there is a significant supplier power. And this ties into the new entrants. Because if it's a supplier-dominated market, then, like any good ecosystem, the way to shake it up is to do something new, do something different. New entrants. That is the opportunity. So, let's talk about what that opportunity is. Technology. Technology is changing how the elderly are cared for. You have alert technologies, so you have like fall detection. You suddenly you're getting heart arrhythmia, which basically means your pulse is now fluctuating randomly, despite not doing any different physical activity. All of these things, your Apple Watch knows. The Internet of Things, again, the Apple Watch, other things, connected devices, is changing how care is delivered to the patient. Because if you know somebody's in trouble, you have a higher probability of being able to help them. Now, if you know somebody's about to be in trouble, that's where you can make the difference. So, the opportunity there is remotely taking doctors into homes. There aren't enough doctors for the population. But if you can take medical services and deliver them at home. That is the opportunity. So you have remote monitoring services. Specific example, Deutsche Telekom, also known as T-Mobile. They have an end-to-end service that recently started with clinical trials and research for developing the platform, and it's a gateway device that allows patient data integration. Why are they doing this? So originally they're a telecom provider, right? So they sell you a mobile plan. You get to talk, you get to watch YouTube, you get to listen to Spotify, etc., etc. But because they have access to those data networks, what can they use them for? They can use them to collect data on your health. And by feeding that into the medical system, they can now create an ecosystem where that information, useful information, so the difference between data and information, right? Everybody talks about big data. Nobody knows what big data is. Big data is just something big to talk about. Let's talk about big data. But the whole point of data is it only becomes useful when you turn it into information. That's what they're trying to do. Device-centric senior services, so IoT connected remote care, call alerts, etc. Doro. Have any of you heard of Doro? Swedish company. No? You should. Do your research on them. They have been around for over a decade. They were a past customer of mine. They're doing very well. In 2015, their revenues went up 16%, growth rate of 22% per year. They only focus on the 65% plus market. They're not providing general health care. They do everything from the elderly focused mobile phones. So it's a mobile phone with 4 buttons. Call son, call daughter, call daughter-in-law, call the doctor. 4 buttons. It's just an emergency telephone. That's it. But they're doing very well. And because they have access to that ecosystem, they are doing product offerings that include connected home monitoring services as well. They could be potential partners. New technology that can radically improve the mobility of an aging population. 3 examples. Cyberdyne, and this is not from Terminator. It was the same company name, but they just like the Terminator, and they called it HAL. Who knows about 2001: A Space Odyssey, the film? There you go. HAL was the name of the supercomputer, right? Yeah? Do you know why? So HAL is IBM, move 1 letter. I, move 1, H. B, move 1, A. M, move 1, L. But they also use the same acronym, and they call it hybrid assisted limb. So it's an exoskeleton that you can wear for parts of your body that are no longer functioning properly. So if it's your knees that don't work, if it's your hip that doesn't work, if it's your elbow that doesn't work, if it's your shoulder that doesn't work, you can put on parts of the exoskeleton to help improve mobility. Robot-assisted movement. Argo Medical Technologies, they created something called ReWalk. Similar, but this one is again only focused on patients suffering from severe osteoarthritis, so where their joints don't work. Toyota WellWalk, another very similar product. Smart home services, we talked about fall detection, emergency alarms, automatic lights. So when an older person needs to get up in the middle of the night, they shouldn't have to look for the lights. If you have a proper connected home that can provide that service, the light should go on. Even better, lights switch on directly into the bathroom, because chances are that's where you're going. Oh, I did something stupid. So let's talk about the IoT value chain of healthcare services. First, you need connectivity. But in the world we live in, whether it's Korea or Germany or most of Greater Europe, connectivity today is something we can take for granted. Everybody here, I presume, has access to data. Yes? Anybody here with no internet? Yeah, I didn't think so. So Then the next part is devices. But devices can be anything and everything. So the important part there is to understand what the device does, how it functions within an ecosystem, how that ecosystem. So very important to understand is that we're trying to create ecosystems, not independent use cases. You can have an independent use case, a specific device that addresses that use case, but if it's not part of an ecosystem, it will not survive. Somebody bigger, better, with better reach will come and blow you out of the market. Management, application, and then the verticals. All of this tied together through system integration. So you have the large system integrators on the planet, Accenture, Capgemini, etc., etc. And they have huge projects lined up in the healthcare sector because they are trying to address healthcare from a governmental and large organization perspective. But we saw, where was it? Here. This is where the Accentures are trying to do their business. This is what we want to talk about. This is us. We're here to make a difference. But when you create devices, particularly in healthcare, particularly in Europe, there's a huge element of responsibility attached to it. And this is regulatory discipline. This is regulation that dictates you need to be able to call back devices from the field. You need to be able to identify every device sold by its serial number until it is scrapped. So from birth to death and rebirth, because that's the new frontier, right? Reusability of existing devices. How do you give them a second life? That's how you make profit on the long term. So Philips, for example, has a huge sustainability program that specifically looks at extending the life of medical devices, where they bring back old devices, repair, refurbish, and redeploy. They have an entire factory near Eindhoven that does just this, only for their medical devices. Everything from large echocardiograms to individual blood pressure monitors. Everything can be reused. Because think about it this way. When you buy a blood pressure monitor for your own use at home, how often do you use it? Once a month at the start, once in 6 months from the second year onwards. It doesn't use its full life. So all it needs is replacement of critical parts that cannot be shared between patients. This is important to understand. Whatever you build, if it's a physical device, you need to know what your area of locus of control, it's called. How do you know which parts are replaceable? If you replace those parts, is it usable again? Something like a battery. Most of us have devices where everybody, when the iPhone 4 launched, everybody went nuts. This thing does not have a replaceable battery. How do I continue to use it after 2 years? Similar questions in the medical world as well. Which parts of a medical device can you replace to give it additional use? This is something to think about when you're doing product design, product development. So in product development, you must already think about sustainable design, circular elements. So does anyone here know about the circular economy? No. So the circular economy talks about giving every product, component, raw material, additional life by either repurposing it, so basically creating a flow where every waste out of one system is somebody else's raw material. If you can do that for yourself, where your own waste is your own raw material, jackpot. That's the ideal situation, which is why companies like Philips are investing in circular design so that they can call back products, retrieve usable parts, and reuse them and redeploy them again. So you no longer have, so as you go over the life of the product, the cost of manufacturing the first product is 100. The second time you use it, it's 60, the third time you use it, it's 30, the fourth time, it's 20. By the time you've used it 10 times, the cost per iteration is 10. Except you're able to sell it on, so every time you do a refurbish worth 10, you're able to sell it for 40. So over the life of a product, it just makes more sense. Except